Okay, yeah, I'm a real old green. I got involved in what we used to call the movement in capital letters in the mid 1960s. 12 years old. Ronald Reagan's running around California to repeal a fair housing law that just passed. So it was clear to me the Republicans were racist. And I watched the Mississippi Freedom Democrats, an integrated state, go to Atlantic City and saw Johnson send Mondale and Humphrey and Joseph Rao, a civil rights lawyer, to tell the Freedom Democrats they'd only get 2 honorary seats, which they rejected. So I'm 12 years old asking, where's my party? And the next year, Johnson escalated in Vietnam, so the anti-war movement became a big deal. And by late 1967, my party came along. It was the Peace and Freedom Party. Peace in Vietnam, freedom for black people. That was the civil rights slogan. And it actually had an ecology plank, whereas the old parties were still talking about natural resource and conservation. This was relating the structure of society and the exploitation of people as well as nature to the need for fundamental changes. And so I, since that time, remained active in independent, progressive politics. The third party in 1972 and 76 was the People's Party. In 1980, it was the Citizens Party. That was Barry Commoner, then the most prominent environmental scientist, who was our presidential candidate. And then because I had been a co-founder of the Clamshell Alliance, and the Clamshell Alliance was invited to the first national meeting to form a Green Party in St. Paul, Minnesota in August 1984, I was sent by the Clamshell Alliance to that meeting, and I've been active in the Green Party ever since. And along the way, I was involved not only in the anti-nuclear movement, but the anti-apartheid movement, organized both worker and consumer co-ops, been involved in a lot of union struggles as a construction worker and then as a Teamster. And the last year I retired. So I got a little pension from the Teamsters and the Carpenters, and trying to live on that and be a full-time revolutionary. And so, some people call me the original Green New Dealer because I was the first candidate in the United States to run on that theme, which I did in 2010 for governor of New York for the Green Party. And we were calling for 100% clean energy by 2020 at that time. And that was because there was climate science saying that the rich countries should do that by 2020. 2 years earlier, James Hansen said the International Panel on Climate Change was too conservative, that its projection of 450 parts per million to get us to 2 degrees Celsius was dangerous climate change, that we had to get below at least 350 parts per million. And that's why Bill McKibben formed 350.org in 2008. So we brought that into the campaign, and we also said, while most of the environmental movement was saying, let's study fracking and use natural gas as a bridge to the renewable future, we were saying, not only should we ban fracking to protect the water, we need to ban it to protect the climate. And subsequent research by some scientists right near where I'm living at now at Cornell found that natural gas is as bad as coal in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, because methane is 86 times more potent in heating the planet than carbon dioxide is over the first 20 years in the atmosphere. And even though methane degrades faster, those 20 years are crucial because we're right up against it. And, we want to get to 350 parts per million. That's the best climate science, not just from Hansen, but from the German Advisory Committee on Climate Change, from the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research in the UK. And they're much more aggressive in what we need to do than the International Panel on Climate Change, which we have to remember, their reports have to be approved by the petrostates and the big carbon emitters, the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, China, India. And they have made those reports underestimate the pace of climate change and understate what we need to do to avert dangerous climate change. Hansen's been saying for over a decade, if we get to 2 degrees climate inertia in the system and the tipping points, the positive feedback loops, like Arctic ice melting, and instead of reflecting heat back into the atmosphere, absorbing it into the ocean, will get us, if we get to 2 degrees, we'll go right on to 3 or 4 degrees. And then we're facing a catastrophe, mass extinctions, ecosystem collapse, agricultural collapse, mass poverty, social conflict and wars. And we're looking at that coming by 2050 over and getting worse from between now and 2050. And it's even worse than that because the carbon dissolves in the ocean as carbonic acid, and it's killing off not just the corals, but potentially the phytoplankton, which provide 2/3 of the oxygen for our atmosphere. So some scientists say by the year 2100, the end of this century, and some of you, probably not me, unless I won't be around that long at 66, but some of you might be, you're facing suffocation. So there's no time to fool around. So, when we ran on the Green New Deal in 2010, I didn't invent it. I got it from the Green parties in Europe, which were campaigning on it. Although actually in 2000, the Green Party had 2 factions back then. The Green Party USA, and I drafted this plank, had a plank calling for a global Green Deal, and instead of a New Deal. And we were talking about using massive investments from demilitarization into clean energy as a way to deal with climate change and global poverty. And so we were thinking about it, even back then. So in 2007, Colin Hines, who is a Green Party advisor and former head of the Greenpeace International Economics Unit, and Larry Elliott, who is the Guardian economics editor, started putting together a plan for a Green New Deal for the Green Party of England and Wales. And they saw the Great Recession, what we call now the Great Recession, coming. So they saw it as a macroeconomic stimulus to get people employed again and using clean energy, which we need to introduce to deal with the climate crisis, as the way to provide that stimulus. Meanwhile, we had the capitalist version of the Green New Deal put out there by Thomas Friedman, the uber capitalist and imperialist columnist at the New York Times. And, he was calling in that first column for an all of the above energy policy like Obama adopted, including ethanol, biodiesel, both of which emit carbon, clean coal. We don't have clean coal, but the idea is you capture the carbon and bury it, and nukes. And he focused on regulations and carbon prices, but no public investment and no link to the economic security programs that we talk about in the Green New Deal. And he returned to it this year when the Green New Deal exploded, when they brought it to Congress and the Sunrise Movement sat in at Pelosi's office. And what he said is, I wanted to recast, referring to his earlier column, green as geostrategic, capitalistic, and patriotic. The Green New Deal is, in other words, for American national security and economic leadership in the 21st century. I believe there is only one thing as big as Mother Nature, and that is Father Greed, aka the market. I am a green capitalist. And that's not what we've been talking about. And but the Green New Deal has now become a contentious term. In 2008, there's been reporting that Barack Obama called for a Green New Deal. That's not true. There was an author, Jeff Biggers, who's written many books about Appalachia, and he, in a Huffington Post column that was widely distributed, said that Obama could deal with the racial tensions between black and white working people in Appalachia and the Rust Belt through a Green New Deal. And Obama never used that term, although he did put in his stimulus some money for green energy, which actually worked as a stimulus. So what did happen in 2008 is the Green Party of England and Wales came out with their Green New Deal. Caroline Lucas first touted it in April 2008 with a column in The Guardian called Wanted a Green New Deal. Caroline at that time was a member of the European Parliament. She's now a member of the Parliament in Britain. And it was a program for a government-led job creation and investment program in clean energy. But it also tried to address economic justice issues with progressive tax reforms, including the windfall oil profits tax. Remember, oil prices were sky high then. and a crackdown on corporate tax evasion and offshore tax havens. And then they wanted financial sector reforms, including breaking up and re-regulating big banks by making some of them green public banks for clean energy financing, and imposing capital controls on the flow of capital in and out of the country and into and out of the financial sector and strategic industries. That was 2008. By March 2009, the United Nations Environmental Program was calling for a global Green New Deal. Again, the basic idea was to revive the global economy and create jobs to fight climate change with green energy investments. And remember, it's March 2009, we're in the middle of that economic crisis and the financial collapse. And by September, the European Green parties in their campaign for European Parliament were campaigning on a Green New Deal, which said we need investments in clean energy, not bank bailouts. They also wanted to harmonize and democratize monetary and fiscal policy across Europe, which is a big problem now because the fiscal policies are dictated from the center undemocratically. And you can see what happened to Greece in that case. And so the European Greens have run on a Green New Deal. They're running on it ever since, and they're running on it right now for European parliamentary elections that are happening this May. So going back to the Green New Deal that we've been talking about, for us, it was key to link questions of economic security to climate security. That was how we were going to get the political coalition we need to get all of these things. And we, recognized that the original Green New Deal was, as Ira Katznelson put in his book about that, titled When Affirmative Action Was White, it didn't really give equal opportunities to Black people in the South or Mexicans in the Southwest because of things like excluding agricultural and domestic workers from the Fair Labor Standards Act. And another problem was it didn't get us out of the Depression. It wasn't a big enough stimulus. It was World War II that did that. And while they talked about economic rights like health care and a job guarantee as early as 1935, when the Committee on Economic Security, with people like Francis Perkins and Howie Hawkins, talked about those things as well as what became Social Security. But they didn't go all the way at that time. Roosevelt did call for a second Economic Bill of Rights in his last State of the Union address in 1944, and he called for everybody having the right to a job, an income above poverty, comprehensive health care, decent housing, good education, and for small businesses and farmers, freedom from monopolistic competition. So we ran on that, Economic Bill of Rights plus clean energy. That was our Green New Deal. And as I said, we called for 100% clean energy by 2020 and 2010, and no new fossil fuel infrastructure, starting with the fracking ban. And we have a single-payer Medicare for all type bill in New York. We were for that. The job guarantee, the energy stimulus would actually, the bottleneck, and this study goes back to the 90s when Ross Gelfspan, former editor and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at the Boston Globe, had some Harvard and MIT scientists and engineers and got some old oil executives to see what it would take to convert to clean energy. They found out the bottleneck was labor. It's going to take a lot of work to make this happen. The technology's there. There's capital shouldn't be an issue. It's getting people to do the construction work and the manufacturing work to make this happen. We want an income guarantee built into the income tax structure, a housing guarantee through a massive expansion of quality public housing, and fully funded public schools and tuition-free public college. I mean, at that time, I was running against Governor Andrew Cuomo. He wasn't governor yet. He was an open seat. He was calling for austerity to deal with the economic crisis because tax revenues were down, and we had a whole progressive tax reform program that would have provided more than enough money for all these programs I'm talking about. So sometimes we posed it as the Hawkins prosperity program versus the Cuomo austerity program. So we ran on again in 2014. Again, fracking came to the fore. It was really a mass movement. and Cuomo had to respond. We got 5% of the vote, the most for an independent party on the left in New York history, going back to the Liberty Anti-Slavery Party, except for two socialists who got 0.5% more in 1918 and 1920 for being the anti-war party in World War I. And so in 2018, we ran on it again, and we really didn't get much traction. It was really the press and the liberal left in the Democratic Party gave Andrew Cuomo a free ride. They did run Cynthia Nixon as a primary opponent, and the problem was, even groups like Democratic Socialists of America, which endorsed her, didn't do their homework. She maxed out for Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders. She was a Clinton-night Democrat, and she really didn't get the issues, particularly on climate change. She was backing a bill that says right in it, the goal is 450 parts per million carbon equivalents in the atmosphere, and we don't decarbonize the economy till 2050, which is a climate disaster if that's what we want to do. And she was weak with the grassroots groups that are fighting these frack gas power plants that Cuomo is flooding the states with. We may have a ban on fracking, but he's fully committed to frack gas power plants and subsidizing nuclear power to the tune of $8 billion for 3 plants that Exelon wanted to shut down. Now, ratepayers are giving Exelon $8 billion. And after the election, and the Sunrise Movement sat in at Pelosi's office, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, joined them, and the Green New Deal became something on everybody's lips. Andrew Cuomo came out for a Green New Deal, but it's pathetic. It's really branding of his program to flood the state with frack gas power plants, subsidize the nukes, and do a little bit of clean energy, but far insufficient. And it's worth noting that Andrea Ocasio-Cortez's AOC's campaign manager was V.G. Ramos, who managed a green campaign the year before. That was Jabari Brisport, city council campaign. So we know where they got the idea of the Green New Deal, even though they don't give us credit. But I think, we have to give them props. They've put the issue on the national agenda. And even though Pelosi has chopped it down to nothing but a non-binding resolution from the select committee they originally wanted, which would have subpoena power and the power to put legislation on the floor, they are going to make it an issue in the 2020 election. The Democratic candidates are all taking a position on it. And because we're the original Green New Dealers, a green ticket will have a platform on which to speak about this issue. So those are the good things about it. The problems are, it talks about electricity, power, not energy, when it says 100% by 2030. Well, at the national level, the carbon footprint of electricity is only 28% of the total carbon footprint. So what about the other 72%? That is kind of left vague what they're going to do about it. It says nothing about banning new fossil fuel infrastructure. If we allow these new frack gas power plants, which is mainly what are being built, along with the pipelines to get the gas there, that infrastructure, the investors expect to be using it for 30 or 40 years. It takes us way past the time when we got to stop emitting carbon. It says nothing about nuclear power, which is disappointing because going back to the clamshell alliance days, Markey, the senator, was our go-to guy when he was a congressman, Congressman Ed Markey, when we were dealing with, nuclear issues at the federal level. He wasn't perfect, but he was better than most. And so we got to really keep pushing for this 2030 deadline. And we got to link the energy revolution to these economic rights. And the analogy I like to talk about is what the Black Freedom Movement did in the 1960s, is they moved from what they called civil rights to human rights, which meant dealing with the poverty problem. They, in the March on Washington in 1963 for Jobs and Freedom, called for the Economic Bill of Rights that FDR had, with the important addition that we end discrimination in employment, education, and housing. And then they put that in a budget and a program for Congress. It came out in 1966 called the Freedom Budget. And it's worth noting Green Party people should note that it was the little Socialist Party that organized the March on Washington and was key in developing this freedom budget. A. Philip Randolph, the labor organizer with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Bayard Rustin, the longtime civil rights and anti-war activist, Michael Harrington were all members of the Socialist Party, and it was the YPSLs, the Young People's Socialist League, that organized that historic march. They were the cadre. They organized the buses. They got the leaflets out. They did all that work. They were on the phones. And they were not a big party at that point. You know, it was just a few thousand people. And YPSLs, I don't know what their numbers were, but I doubt it was over 1,000. But they pulled that off. So you young eco-socialists out there should not underestimate what you can do, and given the timeline under which we're facing, what you got to do. Now, the problem with Randolph, Rustin, and Harrington is that they relied on the Democratic Party to get this freedom budget passed. Johnson won in a landslide, and Bayard Rustin wrote a famous article called Front Protest to Politics, where he said the liberal, labor, black coalition now had a permanent majority, and we could implement the economic program through the Democratic Party. And then Johnson escalated in Vietnam, and they were silent. Randolph had been a war resistor, along with Eugene Debs, as a member of the Socialist Party in World War I. Rustin had resisted being inducted in World War II because he said, I'm not going to fight in a segregated army. These war resistors were now silent on the war. And Michael Harrington, they basically pandered to the Democratic hawks and didn't raise that as an issue. And because of that, isolated themselves from the mass anti-war movement, as well as the more radical elements of the Black freedom movement. Dr. King, who was catching it from all sides at that point, you know, that was the height of Black power, he stayed independent. He even considered an offer to run with the Peace and Freedom Party. They weren't ready to really run a serious campaign, and he probably was smart not to do it. He organized the Poor People's Campaign, whose goal was to go to Washington and cause massive disruption until Congress acted this economic Bill of Rights. And I think that's the kind of path we should be looking to. So last point I'll get to is what an eco-socialist Green New Deal would involve, because the first thing we have to understand is we can get Medicare for all or a job guarantee passed, but we can't secure it as long as the capitalist power structure remains in place, because concentrated economic power translates into concentrated economic power. And it's not just their giving campaign donations to politicians and buying them off. It's that they can go on a capital strike. Give you an example. Dennis Kucinich, when he was what they called the boy mayor of Cleveland, he was in his 20s, got elected on a promise not to privatize their municipal power utility. And unlike most politicians, he kept his promise. So the bankers said, okay, boy, if you won't privatize, we're not going to roll over your line of credit. And every city needs a line of credit because taxes come in bunches and you got to meet payroll every week and meet other expenses. So they cut off the line of credit and forced the city into bankruptcy and Kucinich out of office. That's the kind of private power that the capitalists have that if we don't address, none of these economic reforms and social reforms we win are secure. So that's the first thing why we need a socialist Green New Deal, an eco-socialist Green New Deal. And that has to be an economic democracy based on social ownership of the major means of production, democratic planning, and a reintegration and reconstruction of the city's countryside. And so we're talking about social ownership of key industries and services, an economic plan that ought to be developed in a democratic, decentralized, and federated structure. The local planning boards are elected by the people, and they in turn elect state boards, and the state boards in turn elect a national board that develops a plan that's coming from the bottom up based on people's preferences. One of the things we've got to emphasize is that the plan should be a plan to produce enough, but not ever more, because capitalism, by its competitive structure, generates endless growth, which is destroying the environment. And that's got to stop. So we need to talk about producing enough and distributing it fairly, not just producing more and then hopefully having the big pie trickle down to the rest of it. And in this kind of structure, the capital markets and the labor market will largely be replaced due to public banking and public money and a job guarantee. But small businesses, medium businesses, and commercial markets for goods and services should thrive. We prefer co-ops there, but self-employed farmers, working small business owners, all these people should, if you want to go in business because you get an idea you want to try, or you just like being working for yourself, those kind of enterprises should thrive within the framework of this larger economic plan. And they should thrive because it will be free from monopolistic competition, because the big industries will be socially owned and they'll be operating at cost for public benefit, not for the private profit of absentee owners. So, in the eco-socialist program, we need to start raising the demand to nationalize big oil and gas, because we're never going to get an energy transition as long as ExxonMobil and Chevron and the Koch industries want to extract oil and gas for profit. They're never going to invest their earnings in renewables. We got to make that public. We need a public energy system for our power utilities, because we need that to have effective planning of the transition to 100% clean energy without obstruction from the incumbent generators and distributors of electricity. As I said, we need public money, should be issued, it's right there in the Constitution, by the government, not private banks just creating credits when they extend loans, and then people have to pay it back with interest. In the end, you get debt crises that creates economic instability. And that reform won't be, that's the old greenback reform from the farmer labor populist movement in the 19th century. We should be issuing greenbacks, not U.S. Federal Reserve notes based on bonding, debt money, or letting banks create it, where they create 97% of the money. And we need public banks to make that system really work, as well as an economic plan, so we know where to put the public money. Another piece of it is we need to talk about rebuilding our cities. We need an urban revolution to create walkable mixed-use neighborhoods, convenient and affordable mass transit that's universally available, not like, say, Atlanta, where the train or whatever they call it down there stops when you get to the suburbs. They don't want the inner city people coming out there. We got to stop that. We need much more public housing to deal with the affordability crisis, which is nationwide. And we got to break up the race and class desegregation that is isolating white people to the point where they don't even know the people that they think are taking their jobs, the immigrants, the Muslims, the blacks, when in fact it's the capitalists that are giving them their problems. We need an agricultural revolution and rural reconstruction, because we need organic agriculture and small town manufacturing based on clean biodegradable feedstocks, because we're depleting our aquifers and our soils, and the insects are dying from biocides. And this is something that the scientists, you may have seen the stories recently. I mean, in a decade or two, we're going to be facing a collapse of insect populations. It means a collapse of ecosystems and a collapse of agriculture. I mean, this thing is right on top of us. So all these have to be elements. How are we going to pay for it? Well, a big part of it should come from deep military spending cuts and devoting the peace dividend to a global Green New Deal. We should be demanding that the U.S. be the world's humanitarian superpower instead of its imperialist military superpower that wants to make the world safe for exploitation by global corporations. I mean, this is how we make friends in peace instead of making enemies. And it's common sense. Another thing that we've got to address is that this capitalist system generates international, interstate competition for cheap labor, resources, markets, geostrategic military position, and endless war. And that's in the context of nuclear weapons hanging over our heads and nuclear annihilation being still on a hair trigger. The United States has not repudiated first strike. The weapons are on a hair trigger. A mistake could cause the whole thing to end. So that has got to be part of our program. So to people that say, what I'm talking about is too radical, I'll say, look at what we did during World War II. We nationalized 25% of manufacturing. during the World War II emergency to turn industry on a dime to create the arsenal of democracy that defeated the German Nazis, the Italian fascists, and the Japanese imperialists. And I would argue we should do nothing less today to defeat climate change. So I don't know how long I went, but I'll stop there.